Okay, so we finished off the read aloud where Joseph had just finished up telling the family about his past and he was now milking Rosie. My father kicked out the fire. My mother held me and I said, "Why can't he see Jupiter?" And they said I had to just try to understand. Joseph was only 14. He couldn't be a father. Seeing Jupiter would only hurt him even more, and Jupiter might be upset, maybe even frightened. "Suppose you're wrong," I said. "Suppose Jupiter wants to find Joseph." My mother held me even closer. My father put his hand on my back. Joseph came in late that night. He got ready for bed, then stood by the window, even though the room was really cold. He looked out the panes that were already a little frosted over, and the moonlight flooded him, and his scar was a bright ragged line along his side. He leaned into the glass until his forehead touched the pane. He stood there, perfectly still, the moonlight flooding him as if it would drown him, but he didn't move. "Joseph," I finally said. "It's freezing." He didn't turn around. "What are you looking at?" "I can't see Jupiter," he said. "The moon's too bright, and I don't know where she is." "It's where it always is," I said. "No, it isn't." He wrapped his arms around himself. When he finally turned, I could see his breath in the moonlight. "I'm going to find her," he said. "I am not going to stay alone." "You're not alone." He shook his head. "You're not." "I'm alone," he said. "You've got me," I said. He laughed, but not a happy laugh. "Jackie, I'm a whole lifetime ahead of you," he said. He left the window and climbed up onto the bunk. I wonder what that means. I'm stopping to think about, "Jackie, I'm a whole lifetime ahead of you." And I can infer that that probably means that he thinks he has experienced so much more than Jack has in his life, that he is so much more mature than him. It's not meaning that he's a whole lifetime older than him or anything like that. It's just all the things I think he's experienced is what he's meaning there. "It's Jack," I said. "Yeah." "And no, you're not," I said. He settled into the bed. "Okay." I woke up again and again that night, but I didn't hear Joseph moving or breathing or dreaming. If it hadn't been for the dent his body made above me, I would have thought that he was gone. Downstairs, the chimney clock chimed the quarter hours. I heard a lot of them. Until once I woke and the dent was gone, and I jerked up and looked across the room. Joseph was standing by the window again. The moon was down. He was looking for Jupiter in the cold and the dark. By morning it was snowing. Not a lot, but enough to pile up on the branches. And the barn and the woodpile. And if we wanted to skate again, we'd have to shovel it all off on the pond again. The bus was a little late, and Mr. Haskell skidded the back tires in the new snow when he stopped for us. I guess Mr. Haskell didn't like the way Joseph looked at him when we got on. "Hey, you think you could drive a bus better? Go ahead." He leaned back and pointed to the steering wheel. "Go ahead, try it." Joseph walked past him on the way to the back. "That's what I thought," said Mr. Haskell, and he levered the door closed and gunned the engine so the bus swayed sharply. Joseph walked down the aisle like he was walking on a sidewalk. I fell into Danny Nations. "You want to try finding your own seat?" he said. I slid behind him, next to Ernie Humper, who was looking out the window like it was the most important thing in the whole world. Ernie turned to me, and his face was white. "Listen, Jack." "Relax, Ernie. We're not going to go into the river. We're not going to die because of the snow. Just listen. Don't hang around that psycho anymore, okay?" "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just don't hang out around him." "Why?" "No reason." "Ernie, I said no reason." Danny Nations leaned over his seat, twisting one of his earbuds. "What's so serious back here?" "Nothing," said Ernie. "I think someone's tighty-whities got a little too tighty," said Danny. "Shut up," said Ernie, and went back to looking out the window. Chapter 5. I figured out what Ernie meant a couple of days later, in gym class, a Friday, when Coach Setwick was gone to some stupid PE conference, and we had a substitute who knew as much about running a gym class as a gerbil would. I knew when Ernie told me we had to roll up the mats at the end of the class, and I went to do it with him, and Coach Substitute hollered, "Hey, thanks for doing that without my asking." And I looked at Ernie, and then I looked around the gym, and some of the other 8th graders were still shooting baskets. But Joseph had already gone into the locker room. Nick Porter, Brian Boss, and Jay Perkins were gone too. Ernie said, "Jack." I dropped my side of the mat. Ernie said, "Don't." But I did. The way into the 8th grade side of the locker room was blocked by stupid 8th graders, standing like cows at a gate they can't get through. I ran down the center aisle to the other end of the locker room, and someone was slamming against the lockers, and slamming again. And I heard Joseph yell something, and someone else yell something, and then I got to the end of the aisle, and I turned into the 8th grade side. Jay Perkins was on the floor, bent over and holding his nose because all of the blood was coming out of it. He was hollering, but the words were sort of snotty and hard to make out. Past him, Brian Boss and Nick Porter were both holding Joseph and slamming him again and again against the lockers. I figured they'd worn their cups. Beyond them, the stupid 8th graders stood watching as Joseph slammed again and again. Joseph didn't have much of his shirt left on him, and you could imagine the welts the lockers were leaving on his back. Some blood, too. But that might have been from Jay Perkins. The look on his face? What do you think? Until he saw me. He couldn't say anything because Nick Porter suddenly had his hand across Joseph's jaw, and he was strangling him and shoving him back into the lockers. But even so, when Joseph saw me, he shook his head. He wanted me out of there. Then Jay Perkins stood up. Someone called out, "Jay, enough!" But I don't think Jay Perkins even heard him. And if he did, he wasn't thinking it was enough. He stood in front of Joseph. He was hollering, but he was snarling too. He pulled his arm back, and Nick Porter took his hand away from Joseph's face, and Joseph closed his eyes. Everything stopped. The stupid herd of 8th graders, Nick Porter, Brian Boss, Joseph, Jay Perkins with the blood on his fist. Everything stopped, and I thought I heard some words Joseph cried in his dreams. The words I didn't even know. I think they were coming from me. I pushed off from the lockers, took 3 quick steps, and slammed into Jay Perkins' back. His face plowed into the wire mesh of the lockers, and he fell to his knees again. Then the words were coming out of Jay Perkins, and he didn't just say them. He screeched them loud enough to be heard in the whole different wings of Eastham Middle School. And while he said what he was saying, Brian Boss turned to look at me, and Joseph brought his right knee up as hard as he could. It turned out Brian Boss wasn't wearing a cup after all. He threw up all over Jay Perkins. Then he screeched too. And his right arm now free, Joseph smashed his own fist into Nick Porter's face. Again, and again, and again. He was crying, like at night. He stopped only when the stupid herd of 8th graders scattered and the coach substitute ran in to find out what all the screeching was about. It would have to be Mr. Canton. I sat in his office, still in gym stuff with some blood on me, not my own. 2 offices down, Joseph and Brian Boss and Nick Porter and Jay Perkins were in Principal Tushman's office. You could tell that Jay Perkins was there by the smell, since he had Brian Boss's throw-up all over him. But I was in Mr. Canton's office, and Mr. Canton was standing behind his desk, probably so he wouldn't scuff up his shoes. His arms were crossed. "So you want to tell me what a 6th grader was doing in the 8th grade side of the locker room in an 8th grade fight?" he said. "Winning," I said. "Don't be smart, Jackson. We've talked before about what happens when you're around Joseph Brooke." "It was 3 guys on 1. 3 against 1. What was I supposed to do?" "For starters, go get a teacher." I looked at him. "Would you have left a guy being beat up to go find the teacher?" Mr. Canton looked at me, then sat down. This is what I meant, Jackson. It's Jack. Mr. Canton nodded. This wasn't your fight. This wasn't about you. But look at what happened. You might get suspended for fighting, all because you were hanging around Joseph Brooke. I'm telling you, I know his type. Trouble follows him like a yellow dog. I've seen what happens to yellow dogs, I said. It was 3 against 1. Yes, it was. And I'm not saying you didn't think it was the right thing to do. And I'm not saying it was, and I'm not saying it wasn't. The point is, you're a different kid around Joseph Brooke, and not a better kid. You need to be careful around him. Maybe put some distance between you two. I did think it was the right thing, I said. And you still didn't answer my question. Would you have left a guy being beat up to go find the teacher? Mr. Canton sighed again. Go get clean. Bell rings in 10 minutes. I did. Meanwhile, Mr. Canton called my parents.